The wind howled like a beast outside, rattling the windows and shaking the thin walls of the old house. The rain battered the roof in sheets, and the lightning strikes illuminated the living room for brief moments, casting monstrous shadows on the walls. It was supposed to be an ordinary night, but nothing about this storm was ordinary. In the living room, the family sat huddled together. Robert, the father, a man in his early 40s, with a thinning hairline and tired eyes, glanced at his wife, Emily, who sat clutching their daughter tightly. Sarah, a 12-year-old with wide, frightened eyes, buried her face in her mother's sweater. The lights had gone out an hour ago. First, there had been a flicker, just a blink of darkness, and then the entire neighborhood had gone black. They thought it was just a typical storm-induced blackout, but as the night dragged on, an unsettling feeling had crept into the house, like something sinister lurking in the shadows. "How long do you think it'll last?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the raging storm outside. "I don't know," Robert replied, rubbing his temple. "Could be hours, could be all night." A loud crash of thunder shook the house, making them all jump. The storm seemed to have a life of its own, as if it was feeding off their fear. But they had no idea that something far worse than the storm was coming for them. Sarah suddenly lifted her head, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Robert frowned. "Hear what?" She pointed toward the back of the house. There was a noise. Emily tightened her grip around Sarah, glancing at Robert with a nervous expression. "It's just the storm, honey. Nothing to be scared of." But Robert wasn't so sure. He had heard it too, something faint, like a creak of the floorboards, coming from somewhere deeper inside the house. It was too subtle to be the wind, too deliberate to be anything natural. He stood up, grabbing the flashlight off the coffee table. The light flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow on the walls. "Stay here," he muttered to Emily. "I'll go check it out." Emily opened her mouth to protest, but something in Robert's eyes stopped her. She nodded, pulling Sarah closer to her. Robert gave them a reassuring nod, though his stomach was tight with unease. He made his way toward the kitchen, the beam of the flashlight sweeping across the darkened hallway. The house was eerily quiet now, except for the muffled sound of rain and wind outside. Every creak of the wooden floor beneath Robert's feet felt amplified in the silence. He reached the kitchen door and paused, his hand hovering over the knob. He wasn't sure why, but the air felt different here, heavier, colder. With a deep breath, he pushed open the door. The kitchen was empty, the windows rattling in their frames from the force of the wind. Robert exhaled slowly, letting some of the tension in his body ease. But just as he was about to turn back, he saw something out of the corner of his eye. A figure, a shadow, darting past the window. Robert's heart skipped a beat. He quickly moved to the window, peering outside into the storm. The rain was coming down too hard to see clearly, but there was no doubt in his mind. Someone had been there, watching the house. He swallowed hard, backing away from the window. His thoughts raced. It could have been a trick of the light, the storm playing tricks on his mind. But deep down, he knew better. Something wasn't right. Robert returned to the living room, his face pale. Emily immediately noticed the change in his demeanor. "Robert, what is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. He hesitated, not wanting to alarm her, but he knew he couldn't lie. I think someone's outside." Sarah whimpered, her grip on her mother tightening. "Who?" "I don't know," Robert said, his voice low. "But I saw something." Emily's face went ashen. "Do you think it's just someone looking for shelter from the storm?" "Maybe," Robert replied, though he didn't believe it. "But we can't take any chances. I'm going to check the doors, make sure everything's locked." As Robert moved to secure the house, the storm outside seemed to intensify. The wind howled even louder, and the rain pounded the windows like furious fists. The house groaned under the pressure, as if it were alive and protesting the invasion. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from the back door. Emily screamed, and Sarah clung to her, shaking. Robert rushed to the door, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as his hands trembled. He reached for the handle, his heart hammering in his chest. "Robert, don't," Emily cried out. But it was too late. Robert yanked the door open, and the wind rushed in, whipping his face with cold rain. But there was no one there, just the empty darkness of the backyard, the storm roaring in the distance. He slammed the door shut, bolting it tight. "It's fine," he said, his voice shaky. "Probably just the wind." But they all knew it wasn't. As the minutes passed, the house seemed to grow quieter, the storm fading into the background as an oppressive silence filled the space. Robert, Emily, and Sarah sat in the living room, huddled together, the faint glow of the flashlight their only comfort. And then came the sound, a slow, deliberate creak. It came from upstairs. Robert froze, his blood turning to ice. Emily's breath hitched, and Sarah began to shake uncontrollably. "Did you hear that?" Robert whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Emily nodded slowly, her eyes wide with terror. Another creak. Closer this time. There was no denying it now. Someone, or something, was inside the house. Robert stood, the flashlight shaking in his hand. He motioned for Emily and Sarah to stay put. "I'll check it out," he said, though every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, to take his family and get out of the house. But there was nowhere to go. The storm outside was too fierce, and now they were trapped inside with whatever was lurking upstairs. He moved cautiously toward the staircase, his footsteps eerily quiet on the creaky wooden floor. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. As he reached the top of the stairs, he could hear it, a faint breathing, shallow and ragged, coming from the end of the hallway. Robert's hand tightened around the flashlight as he inched forward. The breathing grew louder, more desperate, as if whatever was making the sound was struggling to stay hidden. And then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his clothes soaked from the rain. His eyes were wide and crazed, his skin pale as death. He stood there, staring at Robert with an unsettling grin. "Who the hell are you?" Robert demanded, his voice trembling. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer, his grin widening. Robert's heart raced. He backed away slowly, his mind screaming for him to get back to his family. But before he could move, the man lunged at him. Robert fell back, crashing into the wall, the flashlight clattering to the floor. The man was on him in an instant, his hands like claws, grabbing at Robert's throat. Robert struggled, gasping for air as the intruder's fingers tightened around his neck. With a surge of adrenaline, Robert managed to kick the man off him. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing the fallen flashlight and swinging it wildly. The beam hit the intruder in the face, momentarily blinding him. Robert didn't waste a second. He charged forward, slamming the man against the wall with all his strength. The intruder grunted, but he didn't go down. He swung back, his fist connecting with Robert's jaw, sending him reeling. Downstairs, Emily heard the commotion and screamed. "Robert!" Sarah was crying now, clutching her mother in terror. Robert staggered, his vision blurred. The intruder advanced again, his face twisted into a grotesque snarl. But before he could strike, Robert grabbed a vase from a nearby table and smashed it over the man's head. The intruder stumbled, blood pouring from a gash on his forehead. Robert, panting and covered in sweat, seized the moment. He grabbed the man by the collar and shoved him toward the stairs. The intruder tumbled down, hitting the steps with a sickening thud. Robert stood at the top of the stairs, gasping for breath. The man lay motionless at the bottom, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. It was over, or so Robert thought. As Robert descended the stairs, his heart still racing, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A faint, gurgling sound. The intruder was still alive. Robert froze, his eyes locked on the man's broken body. Slowly, impossibly, the man began to move. His limbs twitched, and then, with a horrifying crack, he twisted his head toward Robert. "Not over," the man rasped, blood bubbling from his mouth. And then, with an unnatural speed, the intruder lunged for Robert one last time. But this time Robert was ready. He grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and plunged it into the man's chest, again and again, until the light finally left his eyes. The house was silent once more, save for the sound of the storm outside. Robert stood there, drenched in blood, staring at the lifeless body at his feet. He had saved his family, but he knew, deep down, that they would never be the same, and neither would he. The storm outside finally began to die down, but inside, the darkness lingered. Emma and Mark Harrison had always dreamed of moving to a charming old house, and when they stumbled upon the Victorian-era home on the edge of town, They knew it was perfect. Surrounded by ancient oaks and an overgrown garden, the house stood as a relic of the past, full of character and history. Emma envisioned the spacious rooms and tall windows filled with light and laughter. Mark, always practical, saw the house as a promising investment for their family's future. On their first night in the house, the excitement of the move filled the air. Boxes were stacked high, and the sound of tape ripping and furniture scraping across creaky floors filled the house. Their children, Lily and Jake, were eagerly exploring their new home. "This place is huge," Lily exclaimed, her 12-year-old eyes wide with wonder. She was the more adventurous of the two. Jake, a quiet 10-year-old with a fascination for old things, nodded in agreement. "Look at this old cellar door. It's so creepy," Mark chuckled. "Don't go down there. We haven't even checked it out yet." Emma smiled, but a nagging feeling tugged at her. The house was beautiful in its own way, but there was something unsettling about it. The tall windows and intricate woodwork seemed to hold secrets, and the house's silence seemed too heavy. As night fell, the house transformed. Shadows stretched long across the walls, and every creak of the floorboards echoed through the empty rooms. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows in their frames. "All right, kids," Mark said, "time to settle down. We've got a big day tomorrow." Lily and Jake reluctantly headed to their rooms. Exhausted, Emma and Mark climbed into bed, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She brushed it off as nerves and tried to focus on their new beginning. The first few nights passed uneventfully. Emma and Mark began to feel more at home, and the children adapted quickly. But as the days turned into weeks, Emma started to notice something strange. Every night, around midnight, she heard odd noises coming from the basement. At first, it was just faint scratching, but it soon grew louder, like someone moving things around or even walking. "Mark, are you sure this house is safe?" Emma asked one evening, as they sat on the porch, enjoying a rare moment of peace. "Safe? Emma, it's just an old house. It's bound to make noises," Mark replied, trying to reassure her. Emma wasn't convinced. One restless night, she decided to investigate. She crept down the stairs, each step causing the old house to groan in protest. At the bottom of the stairs, the cellar door was ajar, as if someone had recently opened it. Emma hesitated, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She reached for the light switch, but the bulb flickered and went out. The darkness pressed in around her. Suddenly, she heard a faint whisper from the depths of the cellar. "Emma?" Emma's heart pounded. She took a deep breath and forced herself to move forward. Grabbing a flashlight, she descended the stairs. The cellar was cold and damp, the air thick with mildew. Shadows danced on the walls as Emma's flashlight beam swept across old furniture and dusty remnants of the past. In the far corner, she saw a figure huddled in the darkness. Emma screamed and stumbled backward. The figure shifted, revealing a gaunt face with hollow eyes. A man who looked like he hadn't seen daylight in years. "Who are you?" Emma stammered. The man didn't answer. He stood slowly, his movements jerky and unnatural. His eyes locked onto Emma, filled with a desperate, wild look. Without warning, the man lunged toward her. Emma fled up the stairs, slamming the cellar door shut behind her. The man's frantic banging and muffled cries grew fainter as she raced back to her room. She shook Mark awake, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mark, wake up. There's someone in the cellar." Mark blinked groggily. "What are you talking about?" "I saw him, Mark. There's someone down there." Mark's face turned serious. "We need to call the police." When the officers arrived, they found nothing in the cellar. They assured Emma and Mark that it was likely a figment of her imagination, a result of stress and exhaustion. Emma wasn't convinced, but had no choice but to accept their explanation. Days turned into weeks, and the eerie feeling in the house only grew stronger. Emma noticed strange occurrences: lights flickering, doors creaking open by themselves, and the children complaining of nightmares. Each night, the mysterious sounds from the cellar continued, but Mark found nothing out of the ordinary. One evening, while Emma was alone in the kitchen, she heard the basement door creak open. Her heart raced as she grabbed a kitchen knife. She approached the basement door, flashlight in hand, casting long, trembling shadows. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing through the empty house. There was no response. Emma took a deep breath and descended the stairs. The basement felt colder and more unsettling than ever, the shadows shifting unnaturally. She reached the bottom and swept the flashlight beam around the room. It landed on a pile of old newspapers and books, but there was no sign of the figure. Just as she was about to turn back, she heard a familiar whisper. "Emma, help me." Emma turned toward the sound, but the basement was empty. The whisper had come from a small, rusted door barely visible behind a pile of debris. Gathering her courage, Emma approached the door. It was locked, the old padlock hanging loosely. With a deep breath, she forced it open. Inside was a small, cramped room barely big enough for a person to stand. The walls were covered in strange markings, and in the center lay a tattered mattress. Emma felt a shiver run down her spine. Someone had been living here for a long time. Suddenly, a hand reached out from behind her, grabbing her shoulder. Emma screamed and spun around, only to find Mark standing there, his face pale with concern. "Emma, what are you doing down here?" he asked, his voice filled with worry. "There's someone here," Emma said, her voice trembling. "I saw him again." Mark glanced around the basement, then turned back to Emma. "There's no one here. Let's get out of here and lock the door." Reluctantly, Emma agreed. They left the basement, locking the door behind them. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She was convinced that there was something, or someone, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. One night, as a violent storm raged outside, Emma was jolted awake by a loud bang. Lily and Jake's terrified screams echoed through the house. Emma and Mark rushed to their rooms, finding their children wide-eyed and shaking. "There's someone in our room," Lily cried. Mark and Emma tried to comfort them, but the dread in the house was palpable. Emma decided to investigate again, determined to uncover the source of the disturbances. She grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs, her heart pounding. As she approached the basement door, she heard the whisper again, clearer this time. "Emma, help me." The basement felt colder than usual. Emma took a deep breath and opened the door, the darkness swallowing her as she descended the stairs. She reached the small room and hesitated before entering. Inside, the markings on the walls were clearer, almost glowing in the dim light. Emma's eyes were drawn to a strange symbol etched into the floor, a circle with a series of runes. It looked like a ritualistic symbol. Suddenly, the gaunt man appeared in the doorway. His eyes were wide and filled with a desperate, pleading look. His clothes were tattered, and his skin was pale and clammy. "Emma, help me," he repeated, his voice weak. Emma took a step back, her heart racing. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man's expression changed, a mixture of pain and anger crossing his face. They put me here. I'm trapped." Emma's mind raced. She remembered the history of the house, the rumors of a missing man who had disappeared years ago, never to be found. The pieces began to fall into place. "Why didn't you leave?" Emma asked. "I can't. They won't let me." Before Emma could respond, the man let out a blood-curdling scream. His body convulsed and fell to the ground, writhing in agony. The room was filled with a sickening stench, and the markings on the floor seemed to pulse and writhe. Emma stumbled backward, her mind reeling. The man's screams faded into silence, and the basement was once again engulfed in darkness. Emma rushed back upstairs, locking the basement door behind her. The storm outside finally began to subside, but the darkness inside lingered. Emma and Mark held their children close, trying to provide comfort amid the chaos. Emma knew that their lives had changed forever, that the house's secrets were far from over. The house, with its hidden past and its lingering presence, would never let them forget what had happened. Emma and her family would always carry the weight of their experiences, and the echoes of the dweller below would haunt their dreams for years to come. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon as Jenna, Mark, Lydia, and Dave pulled their old Jeep into the clearing of Whispering Pines campground. The name had always seemed a bit too quaint, too perfect. But that was exactly why Jenna had picked this spot. She was looking for a place where the city noise couldn't reach them, where they could be alone. The forest stood like a dark, brooding wall around them, ancient trees stretching their gnarled branches into the darkening sky. They unloaded the camping gear, their laughter and chatter echoing through the trees. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a chance to escape the pressures of their everyday lives and reconnect with each other. Lydia, the most outdoorsy of the group, took charge of setting up the tents, while Mark and Dave gathered wood for the fire. Jenna, always the nervous one, sat on a log, nervously scanning the forest. "You're gonna have to relax, Jenna," Mark said, tossing a few more logs onto the growing fire. "It's just a camping trip." "I know," Jenna replied, her voice wavering. "It's just, this place gives me the creeps. I heard some weird stories about whispering pines." Lydia glanced over her shoulder. "Oh, come on, it's just campfire stories. Nothing to worry about." The evening passed with typical camping activities, roasting marshmallows, telling ghost stories, and playing games. As darkness settled over the campsite, the fire's light flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced among the trees. The group fell into a comfortable silence, the only sounds being the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. But as the night deepened, an unsettling feeling began to creep over Jenna. She kept hearing rustling noises just beyond the edge of the light, faint whispers that seemed to come from the forest. She tried to ignore it, attributing it to the wind or perhaps the imagination playing tricks on her. "Do you guys hear that?" Jenna finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark looked up from his phone. "Hear what?" "That rustling sound, like someone's moving around out there," Jenna said, her eyes darting towards the darkness. Dave, ever the skeptic, chuckled. "It's probably just some animals, raccoons or something. There's nothing to worry about." "I don't know," Lydia said, her tone more serious. "I think we should check it out, just to be sure." They all agreed, albeit reluctantly. Dave grabbed a flashlight and led the way, the beam cutting through the darkness. The trees seemed to close in around them, their shadows stretching and shifting as if alive. They walked in silence, the forest eerily quiet except for the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. "There's nothing here," Dave said after a few minutes, his voice tinged with irritation. "It's probably just a figment of your imagination." But as they turned to head back to the camp, Lydia stopped. Her face went pale as she pointed to something on the ground. "Look at this." At their feet lay a small, crudely carved wooden figure. It looked like a primitive totem, its features grotesque and unsettling. Jenna shivered as she stared at it. "This is creepy," she said. "Who would leave something like this out here?" "I don't know," Mark said, picking up the figure. "But I don't think it's something we should be messing with." They returned to the camp, the totem figure tucked away in Mark's backpack. The fire had dwindled to embers, and the shadows seemed to grow even darker. Jenna tried to push the unsettling feeling out of her mind, but it lingered, like a dark cloud hanging over them. Later that night, as the others slept, Jenna lay awake in her tent, her mind racing. She kept hearing the whispers again, more distinct this time. They seemed to be coming from all around her, a chorus of faint, unintelligible voices. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but the feeling of being watched was too strong to ignore. Unable to sleep, Jenna decided to step outside for some fresh air. The cold night air hit her like a wall, and she wrapped her jacket tightly around herself. The forest was eerily still, the only sound her own breathing. She walked over to the edge of the campsite, where the darkness seemed to swallow the light. Suddenly, she saw something move in the shadows, something tall and thin, barely visible among the trees. Jenna's heart raced as she strained to see what it was. The figure seemed to glide between the trees, its movements smooth and deliberate. She took a step back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the oppressive silence of the forest. Jenna turned to head back to the camp, but something made her stop. She noticed something strange on the ground, a trail of small, freshly broken branches leading deeper into the woods. Against her better judgment, Jenna followed the trail, her flashlight illuminating the path ahead. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees pressing in like silent sentinels. She followed the trail until she reached a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a figure, its back to her. Jenna's blood ran cold as she realized the figure was wearing a tattered cloak and a hood that obscured its face. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if urging her closer. She took a tentative step forward, but as she did, the figure turned abruptly. What she saw made her scream. The face beneath the hood was a horrifying mask of twisted flesh and hollow eyes, a grotesque parody of human features. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at Jenna, and the whispers seemed to crescendo into a deafening roar. Jenna turned and ran, the forest now a blur of dark shapes and flickering shadows. She stumbled back to the camp, her heart pounding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She burst into the tent, waking the others. "Wake up! Wake up!" Jenna cried, her voice filled with panic. "There's someone out there." The others jumped up, confusion and concern etched on their faces. "What happened?" Mark asked, his voice groggy. "There's something in the woods," Jenna said, her voice trembling. "A figure. It was wearing a cloak, and its face, it was awful." The group exchanged worried glances. Lydia grabbed the flashlight and headed outside, the others following closely behind. The forest was still and silent, the only sound their footsteps crunching on the leaves. They searched the area, but there was no sign of the figure. "Are you sure you saw something?" Dave asked, his voice skeptical. "I'm sure," Jenna insisted. "It was real." They returned to the camp, the uneasy feeling still lingering. They huddled around the dying fire, trying to calm their nerves. But the whispers continued to echo in Jenna's mind, a haunting reminder of what she had seen. As the night wore on, exhaustion took its toll, and one by one they drifted back to sleep. Jenna lay awake, her eyes fixed on the darkness outside. She kept hearing the whispers, growing louder and more insistent, as if something was trying to get through. Just before dawn, Jenna decided to take another look around the campsite. The sky was still dark, and the forest was shrouded in a heavy mist. She walked cautiously through the trees, her flashlight flickering in the damp air. She found herself back at the small clearing where she had seen the figure earlier. The totem was gone, and in its place was a pile of freshly dug earth. Jenna's heart sank as she realized what it meant. Without warning, the figure appeared again, emerging from the shadows. Jenna's breath caught in her throat as she stared at it, her body frozen with fear. The figure raised its hand, and the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of distorted voices. "No!" Jenna screamed, backing away. "Stay away from me!" The figure advanced slowly, its face a nightmarish mask of decay. Jenna turned and ran, the mist swirling around her, the whispers growing louder and more chaotic. She stumbled back to the camp, her mind reeling. When she reached the camp, she found Mark, Lydia, and Dave huddled together, their faces pale and frightened. "We need to get out of here," Jenna said, her voice urgent. "Now." The group packed up their belongings in a frenzy, their movements frantic. As they left the campsite and drove away from Whispering Pines, Jenna looked back one last time. The forest seemed to watch them, its shadows shifting and swirling in the early morning light.